Hello and welcome to the Circular Economy Show from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. You're joining me, Colin Webster, with my colleague, Pippa Shawley.
Hi, Colin. We know at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that we didn't invent this idea of the circular economy, but we did reframe it and we took some inspiration from other schools of thought. So we thought we'd dive into what those schools of thought were and look at how they're applied today. So do you want to give a little introduction to which topics they are?
Yeah, that's right. So this is a 5-part series where we're going to look at these origins of the circular economy, as you say, Pippa. So we will look at cradle to cradle, regenerative design, industrial ecology, the performance economy, and in this episode, we shall look at biomimicry.
And I think what will be really nice in this is to go beyond the theory of some of these and look at how they're applied today and how they relate to the circular economy as we see it.
Absolutely, that's right. So we're starting with biomimicry, and Pippa, I hold a gun to your head and I say, what does biomimicry mean to you?
I do love a pub quiz, but this is maybe quite tricky to answer. So for me, it means inspired by nature. So looking at what technologies nature has in itself and then applying that to our human world. So one example that I've heard quite often is about the bullet train in Japan. And when it was originally designed, it created a sonic boom, which when it went through tunnels, it shattered windows, made this horrible noise and wasn't really fit for purpose. And then a guy came along who was also an ornithologist and looked at the way that kingfisher flies and goes through water. And so redesigned the train so it has this beak, which is also creates a better airflow so you don't get that sonic boom. Am I going along the right track here, Colin?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, that's like the classic case study of biomimicry in action. Right, we've got 2 guests on the podcast this week. Let's hear how one of them defines biomimicry.
Biomimicry is the practice and the perspective and the philosophy of looking to nature for solutions to our complex problems.
So it's beyond just this one product, this one train, this one building. It sounds like it's a whole system.
Yes, and we'll hear that says Stefano Semprini, who's the co-director of Biomimicry South Africa, and we'll hear a lot from him in this episode where he looks at biomimicry as something much, much bigger than simply product innovation. Let's start with a little bit of the origins of where biomimicry comes from, and I think a lot of our audience might know this already, that the big figurehead name, of course, in biomimicry is Janine Benyus.
Yeah, we've had her a few times on the show, and she always goes down very well.
Yes, I can well imagine. Right, so she wrote the book in 1997, literally wrote the book on biomimicry inspired by nature, in which she encourages people to ask, what would nature do when confronted with a problem? And that problem could be at a product level, but it could also be at a systems level, as Stefano was suggesting there. And subsequently, Janine has been behind, or one of the people pushing for the launch of the Biomimicry Institute, which is all about education and taking the idea of biomimicry across the world. And in fact, that's where Biomimicry South Africa comes from. I believe that kind of push too. And then they have a consultancy firm as well, Biomimicry 3.8, which you may well have heard of too.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Stefano. And in this conversation I have with Stefano, you'll hear us talk about a favourite film of mine called Mind Walk, but we'll get to that later. First of all, I asked Stefano if he's concerned that people have become disconnected from nature.
I'm in the same school of I've spent a long time trying to understand this. My training in biomimicry went hand in hand with training, self-directed training and systems thinking, and that was my search for root causes to try and understand why are we where we are, and that's always continued. You'll have the likes of Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissary, the Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, who will point out that in any organism where we find a brain, we find that the brain has 2 hemispheres. Now, why is that? Because we apparently need 2 different types of attention to survive. One which is wide and paying attention to the patterns, one which is narrow and highly focused, that gives us the ability to pay attention to details and have the dexterity to use tools and so on. And it turns out that we need 2 different bits of neurological hardware to do those 2 different types of attention. Now, Ian McGilchrist goes on to point out that we've somehow created a world where we've doubled down on the detail-orientated mode of attention of the left hemisphere, whereas it's the broader perspective of the right hemisphere, which is actually primary in some senses. So I think there's been a schism there that I see as one component of it, and then other thought leaders that I follow, the likes of Fritjof Capra, will point out that the convergent crises of our time are symptoms of a single crisis, a meta crisis of perception. So it's us perceiving ourselves as separate from nature is the very cause of us becoming more separated from nature. And I have other deeply philosophical, only partially scientifically validated ideas about why this is, but I'm going to mention just one, which is that I can't but help notice how around the time when we started seeing the first large city-states arising in the world was also when we started to find the major faith-based traditions arising in the world, which all in one way or another said to us, there's something wrong with our nature. We need to impose principles and rules upon how we live. We've sinned. We've strayed from the path, and I think when we started to dominate our own nature, that's when we really started to bifurcate and diverge from the rest of life, rather than just allowing ourselves to be with it and to not dominate ourselves.
Talking of Capra, have you seen the film Mind Walk?
I have. I love it.
I absolutely love it. I always recommend it to people because it captures a lot of what you've just said. It covers all of this in a very accessible, slightly outdated looking, but nevertheless, the content is so good that
it's so rich.
People love it. People love it when they watch it. They've got reservations, but then they see it and they're like, whoa, this is big.
Yeah, they get it, and I love how they use the environment in the movie to explain the Cartesian divide, literally going and looking at the clockwork, because that obviously refers back to this idea that that if you take apart the clock and understand how its parts, then if you put it back together, you understand the clock. And we know that life doesn't function that way. Is that emergence and wholeness is a property, it's a quality of a system which only exists at the level of the sum of the parts. It doesn't exist in any of the parts individually. And so there's this, there we start to get into understanding exactly how ecosystems come into being.
Colin, I've never seen this film, Mind Walk. Would you mind describing what it's about for me and other listeners that might not have watched it either?
Yeah, sure. He talked a little bit about the broad themes there, but in essence, it's a conversation between three people. So there's a politician, an artist or a writer, I think he's a writer, and a scientist. And they're wandering around a monastery in France, having a conversation about the state of the world, the state of science, the state of politics. And in essence, the politician's getting a real schooling, particularly from the scientist, about the fact that we're thinking of our problems in the wrong way. In our language, we're looking at things in a linear way and not from a systems perspective, understanding all of the minute connections between actions and outcomes. The film itself is based on, their script is based on this work of Fritjof Capra, who is he's a physicist who's written some very influential books on the matter, and I think it was his brother who actually directed this film. But like I said there to Stefano, some people have reservations when I first tell them about the film because it maybe doesn't sound that exciting, but as soon as you start watching it, you're 10 minutes in, you are hooked. So give it a go, Pippa.
All right, I'm going to seek that one out.
Right, so as you might have picked up there from the conversation so far, Stefano is very much a big picture guy. Let's get back to that conversation with him. But nevertheless, when I look at, say, a website like Ask Nature or get examples of biomimicry, I often see the detail and the small picture, but not often the big picture. Is that a fair summary? And what does biomimicry have to say about the big picture?
It's a really, really good question. I think we focus on the details because at the level of forms, it's easier to solve problems at this stage. We're simply not sophisticated enough in the practice, I would say, to really get into the nitty-gritty, because when we start talking about the bigger picture, what we're really talking about is socioeconomic problems. We're talking about how do we redesign our economy, how do we build organizations that function like ecosystems. So at the level of form, which is where most of those technologies are arising, it's simply easier to do at that level, number one. Number two, it's easier to, again, it comes back to the question of economics, because it's easier to create a marketable product at that level. And also we live in a world where by and large, there's a techno-optimist, narrative at play, which we believe that it's just that next technology that's just around the corner that's going to save us. And so we think that if we just, again, we think that if we have, my view is that if we just use biomimicry to create more efficient and more elegant and more sophisticated technology, then we're just going to make the world a more efficient world-eating machine. We're not going to get to the root cause. I think at the deeper level, what does biomimicry have to say about it? Again, I think it comes back to appreciating our own nature and observing ourselves as a species, as a social animal, and saying, let's not presuppose the rules of how we should be. Let's do this, using observation. Let's use heuristics. Let's look at our own behavior and then model what we should be doing based on that, rather than saying, oh, look, there's something, we've done something wrong. Now we have to correct for that. Let's use our intelligent brains to do that. I would never do what some have done, which is to say, oh, let's look at, ants and how colonies thrive and try to apply some of the social dynamics there to human systems. I don't think we're going to get at it that way. I think it's too much of a superposition, So it really, I think, is a process of, for me, biomimicry at the level of the socioeconomic is it's psychology. It's about our emotions. It's about our relationships, and it's very soft.
So, Colin, I want to stop it here and just reflect on what Stefano's just said, because I think when we often talk about biomimicry, I think we think about those ant colonies and their behaviour, or we use fungi patterns to influence town planning. That I've read about that quite a lot recently. But Stefano's talking on a different level here. Can you back up a little bit and go into that?
I think for me, yeah, he's saying it's not about literally applying some of these rules, but it's about applying what we instinctively understand about how nature or living systems operate. And I would say that is something that we do with the circular economy when we talk about it being inspired by living systems, but it can never completely mimic them. But if it has the underlying rules of how these systems work, and realizing that there are these deeper, more complex connections, that we can't control every aspect of it. And this is what systems thinking is ultimately about. Yeah. And for me, that is what he's saying. It's understanding that there's complexity, but I think being humble enough to realize that we can't control every aspect.
I think being humble is something that's emerging from what Stefano's saying here.
Yeah, and he very much is big picture at every stage, isn't he? In fact, I went on to ask him that very question. So it sounds to me like you're saying biomimicry has a role to play in a bigger picture philosophy.
I think that's exactly it. It's when we talk about the three C's of biomimicry, the practice of biomimicry is framed having three components. The most superficial, I would say, is the emulation, the innovation inspired by nature. Within that, we then say we have the ethos. So again, that's the philosophy. But within that, it's the connection or the reconnection to ourselves and to the world around us. So it is about a philosophical question of what are our values and where do we derive our values, and then saying, that's saying, what's our why? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we doing this journey of progress? And then say, okay, what do we really need and want to see in the world? And then biomimicry and regenerative practices like us give us the how.
Colin, this is all quite deep. It's much more than just taking that kingfisher idea on the train or the ant colonies.
Yeah, I found throughout the conversation with Stefano, I kept wanting to push him to tell us about some cool product innovations.
Yeah.
Because I guess, to my shame, that's where my mind goes quite a lot when I think about biomimicry is the blades and the turbine that could be redesigned in the shape of the fin of the whale and so on.
I also think that's a real thing with the circular economy in general, is that we're now at a place where we feel like we understand a lot of the theories and the reasoning why we should do it, but we're all really desperate to just start applying it.
Right, yeah, I think that is where we're at, right? We're at that implementation stage now of the circular economy. So with that in mind, let's look at the implementation of, well, in this case, of biomimicry. We've got a second guest. His name is Chad Wasilenkoff, and he is a serial entrepreneur, and he's the CEO of Helicoid, who make helicoids.
What is a helicoid, Colin?
Well, that's a bit embarrassing. Well, just as well, I asked Chad. So
Thank goodness.
over to him.
Yeah, so the helicoid is a shape or a structure. So our technology is biomimetic, meaning it came and it was inspired by nature. It came from this mantis shrimp. So it's evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And this mantis shrimp has these two clubs in front of it. It smashes other known hard organisms, and it does it hundreds of thousands of times without breaking the clubs. This movement is actually the fastest movement of any organism on the planet. It actually boils the water and cavitates the water. It's so fast. And as I said, it does it hundreds of thousands of times without breaking. So the researchers and scientists wanted to understand that, and their original thought was it must be some super material, but it wasn't. It was just this internal architecture. It's a way of dissipating energy, and from that, it has, again, extreme performance. And that shape that it makes is called a helicoid. So for your viewers, the best way to think about it, if you have a table in front of you, if all the fibers were laid out at the 0 degrees, so straight away from you right now, the next layer, it doesn't matter if you go left or right, but say you go left 10 degrees and do the entire table again, and then keep going left by 10 degrees, that shape with that rotation is called a helicoid. Through their evaluation, they've also, at the same group of universities that were studying all this helicoid, have also found over 50 other organisms on the planet that have incredibly strong performance characteristics. There's a beetle in California. You can drive over it with a steamroller and things like that. No and way. These organisms as well have evolved over hundreds of millions of years with this internal helicoid architecture. So these universities originally patented this technology for use in any and all composites. Those patents are granted. And then I, in turn, have licensed those to now commercialize them, to roll them out into the composite world.
So a helicoid is inspired by a violent shrimp with these insane club bits attached to the front of it with these layered lattice structure, which is extremely powerful. And I guess when you apply that to human technologies, there are lots of potential uses there, Colin.
There are an almost endless number of uses, as Chad goes on to tell us.
So our helicoid technology is an internal architecture for composites. So if you think about a traditional composite you might see, whether it's carbon fiber or fiberglass, say in a BMW or Mercedes, you typically see that woven carbon fiber traditional look and feel. That, unfortunately, is not as strong as it could be using the same fibers and the same resin, but just putting it together differently in the shape of a helicoid internally can almost double the performance. And so your choices are to get better performance and safety, or you can use less of the raw material to get the same safety and performance, and you have a lighter weight product, which helps if you're an electric vehicle. You obviously have better range, lighter composites in aerospace. I mean, the plane can go farther, better fuel efficiency, without sacrificing that performance.
Tell me what the story is about how your company uses this helicoid architecture.
Sure. So I'm not a composite expert or an engineer. I'm more of a serial entrepreneur. So I've built over 30 successful companies. I've taken more than a dozen companies public and raised over $1 billion for those various companies. I've got one unicorn and lots of exits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And I was actually volunteering at the University of San Diego and the University of Riverside here in California. And I mentor some of the professors and guest speak at their entrepreneurial classes and help some students. I also do some judging, kind of like the Shark's Tank and things like that. And from that, I was out with one of these groups one night, and I said, you have a collective group of universities here. They call it the Regents. You do hundreds of millions of dollars of research every year. You have in-house patent lawyers. What's the most interesting, disruptive, ready to commercialize technology that you have? And they all said it was this helicoid. So I heard a little bit more about it, started to do some research on composites, got quite excited. To be honest, it sounded too good to be true. So then I went and found an industry expert, as I always do with my various companies, to do the due diligence. So I found a gentleman. He had just retired within a couple of months, so his experience was very relevant. But he'd spent 35 years at Boeing, all in composites. He was in charge of projects for $30 million to take 2 or 3 pounds of weight out of an airplane. So he flew down, did all the due diligence, said this thing is game-changing. He actually asked, can I join the company? And I'd like to actually get all my compensation in equity or shares because he believes in it so much. So that was sort of the impetus of the company, and we've built it about 4.5 years ago, and we've grown it ever since. We now have over 50 different customers that are engaged at various stages of prototyping, testing, and things like that. We're in the global leading hockey stick. So CCM has finally announced and launched it. So if you go down to your sporting goods retailer, you'll find that the top of the line CCM hockey stick has our logo down on the blade.
So, Colin, it sounds like this helicoid material is stronger and lighter than alternative materials like fiberglass. And in turn, that's money saving and material saving. And it sounds like there are multiple uses for that.
Yeah, I think he said there are 50 different customers that are using the helicoid. And that's really fascinating because he talks about how he set the company up. And they don't actually make these products themselves. They license the IP of the structure. That's why it has so many different uses. Let's let Chad explain more.
When I originally started the company, I thought we were going to get into manufacturing. I've had lots of businesses with thousands of employees all over the world and very comfortable in that environment. So my original business plan was to do that. But as we've evaluated it further and got deeper into how spectacular this performance can be and how game-changing it can be and disruptive to so many industries, we decided to go on a different business path of licensing our technology. So rather than building, as an example, the wind turbine blades is a huge industry. It's over $12 billion a year. We can have a big impact on that. But if I were to build a wind turbine blade site, I'd need a couple hundred employees, probably $100 to $200 million in working capital to start, both the capital expenditure, but obviously to build up the working capital to before we get our first sales. And that'll take several years. So we decided rather than doing that for wind turbines and hockey sticks and pickleball rackets and automobile parts and things like that, we just go to the incumbents. So these large multi-billion-dollar companies, they already have market share. Rather than trying to compete with them, we're going to collaborate with them. It's also sort of a biomimetic type of theme that you find in nature for successful organisms. And so from that, now we talk to these multi-billion-dollar companies. A lot of them are well on their way for testing and trials. We've demonstrated 20, 30% improvements in either reducing raw material costs, reducing weight, improving fuel efficiency. And so we're actually a virtual company. We have no offices. We don't make anything. We just license our technology. So it's a long sales cycle because nobody's going to take our word for it. But once they've done their testing and see how game-changing it can be, and they adopt it, then again, we just collect royalty checks if they want to utilize the benefit of the helicoid, because we have a family of patents that are global in nature. Our product is applicable to tens of thousands of different products. So we have numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head, but even on an airplane, we think we can take, because of traditional commercial aircraft now, and each one is a little different, and that's why there's no perfect math, but they're getting up to, and some are even over 50% composite material. If you apply the helicoid to all of that, I'm not saying they're going to, but if you did, we think we could take up to 50,000 pounds of weight out of an aircraft, which the fuel efficiency would be off the charts in terms of its long range, or increasing that range, and again, just being more efficient over time, especially over the lifetime of the part. As an example, we have one part we've worked on with multiple customers. It's called an engine containment ring. So this is the ring that goes around the turbine fan. So when you're sitting on a big airplane, you see the turbine spinning around. In case a bird were to strike in there, it could cause a blade off of it, which could take the plane down. So a big safety feature is this ring of carbon fiber just to protect that blade off of it. We've already demonstrated we can take the raw material cost savings is $38,000 per part for every time they would switch it just to a helicoid. We'd make that part 17% lighter. And of course, on the average, because it's always fuel efficient or fuel prices are changing and the weight of the plane and things like that, but we estimate on average that should save $5 million over the lifetime of that part in terms of fuel efficiency. So these are big, substantial numbers. It doesn't get adopted right away. There's a lot of testing and FAA approvals and things like that. But we're making great inroads with dozens of customers in all the different industries we're working on. We're demonstrating the performance.
There are some really bold claims in there, like the idea that 50,000 tons, which I just did a quick Google and it's about 22.5 tons in metric, can be saved. So that sounds like a really great thing to have. But this is the circular economy show. Is it a circular product?
So you're asking, can this product, once it's no longer useful, be turned into another one, be repurposed in some way?
Exactly.
Ultimately, it cannot be recycled. This
Right.
is the big negative of the helicoid. Because it's a composite, it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to take apart at the end of its life. So definitely a cross in the box when it comes to circular economy in that sense. But I think what you can pick up from what Chad was saying were all those positive things that the fuel efficiency on an airplane, if this is applied in a large scale, would make incredible savings in terms of jet fuel used, because it's much tougher than its alternatives, which are also not recyclable, by the way. These parts would need replaced a lot less, so there's some material savings to be made in that respect, and all of which adds up to financial savings. He said it's $5 million over the lifetime of one small part on an aeroplane. So of course you scale that up and you can see lots of benefits. Definitely.
But where's the circularity fitting in this, Colin?
Okay, keep pushing me. Right, so I mean, my take on all of this is I think it's a wonderful architecture, and it makes all of these great savings that we can be excited about. But perhaps we say it doesn't quite fit with the circular economy. We know what the destination is for a circular economy, about materials that never get out of these loops, these technical materials that are constantly in use for the long term.
Yeah.
This is not one of those that has that very long-term process because it cannot be recycled, but it makes all of these savings. So I would put this into a transitionary scenario, something that'd be extremely useful for helping us get over that line to bring down those fuel demands and bring down some of those material demands too, in order to help us get to where we want to be.
That sounds positive, Colin.
Thank you. Right, we're actually going to go back to Stefano now to continue that chat about the circular economy. So let's head back to South Africa. Do you think in the circular economy, there's something about that bigger picture that interests you?
Absolutely. I'll start by saying that my one gripe with saying the circular economy is that we're again talking about it as a noun. It's saying the circular economy, whereas in biomimicry, we're always trying to speak in terms of functions. What is life doing? So it is certainly circulating value. It is circulating all the time. And what I love about just being able to say the circular economy, though, is that the word circular is there, that we're already saying, right, everything operates in cycles. And as soon as we do that, we get away from the linear, waste-based model of extraction and accumulation. So at a very, very high level, it gives us a North Star to point to.
So again, it's that mindset change, isn't it? Just like you said, to study biomimicry or to study nature is to immediately change your mindset and think about how the world works. The use for you, the word circular, does something similar.
Absolutely. And, Michael Paulin in one of your previous podcasts already referenced Donella Meadows and her work on systems. And of course, she pointed out that within her model of the 12 leverage points in a system, being able to recognize paradigms as paradigms and move between them is the highest lever. It's the strongest lever we have. So it's exactly that. It's about changing that paradigm.
So Pippa, I would say that's exactly what we are trying to do in our work with AMF, right? We're trying to change paradigms, change the way that people think about how the economy can operate. And I believe, and I work in education, so I should believe this, that if we change the way that people think, that will lead to changing the way that people act.
I think that's right, Colin. And what I've really taken away from this is that bigger picture and changing the way we think rather than zooming in to the specifics straight away.
Yeah, and I think that's, for me, that's where the inspiration is in biomimicry. It is about a way of thinking, which can lead to some incredible systems that one can develop, and the circular economy for me is one of them. At the product level, yes, you can also create tremendous savings, and long term, what we want to be looking at, of course, are nature-inspired product innovations that fit within the circular economy perfectly.
So it's going back to the principles of a circular economy. It's thinking about the cycles, regenerating nature, thinking about how we design things. Where else does biomimicry fit in there?
I think you've covered it really well. It is about that big picture. So I would say what the biomimicry has given to the circular economy is that systems perspective. It's that overall, the heuristic, the way of understanding how living systems work and applying that to our economy, both in terms of being able to tell good stories, which I think are crucial. And I think we've heard that a lot from Stefano here as well. but also in terms of flows. So for me, this circular economy is a biomimetic system because, as Stefano puts it, that is how nature works.
And I think also, Chad talked about this a bit as well, is the multidisciplinary side of things. So working with the scientists, but the investors, and maybe not necessarily trying to compete with people that are doing things in the old linear way, but collaborating with them, which, as I think it was Stefano said, that's how it happens in nature as well.
Yeah, and to quote Janine Benyus, since we started there, she said there should be a biologist at the design table. So that fits with that multidisciplinary way of doing things. And I think that helps people, to repeat the theme here, to think very differently.
I love the idea of a biologist at the table. If people want to find out more about biomimicry, where can they go?
My first port of call would be the Biomimicry Institute. And you'll find them online quite easily. They've got a wonderful website, incidentally, also called Ask Nature, where you can say, well, how does nature, adhere to surfaces whilst underwater? And you'll have lots of hits from that. In fact, that's where Helicoid came from originally. That it is part of that Ask Nature database.
So it's a bit like a magic 8-ball. You can shake
yes.
it and see what solutions come out.
Yes, perfect. So if you've enjoyed this episode, thank you very much for listening. We are exploring the 5 schools of thought that inspired the circular economy. What's next, Pippa?
Next up, it's Cradle to Cradle.
Brilliant. Looking forward to that. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with the people who you think will be interested, and join us next week on the Circular Economy Show.